Human gets alien queen's clone pregnant, now the real queen wants her turn. The storm had long passed, but its scars remained. Kael'Wood stood at the edge of the Crimson Palace's monolithic spire, his reflection fractured across panels of obsidian glass. Once the golden boy of Earth's elite tactical corps, his name now circulated in hushed tones, the whistleblower, the traitor, the man who traded stars for silence. But the stars had called again. Not with forgiveness, with necessity. Commander Wood, the Tan liaison announced in her crystalline accent, red skin gleaming under pale earth light. You've been summoned by order of Queen Nisara herself. Effective immediately. Kael's jaw tightened. This wasn't a request. It was a lifeline, or a leash. The Crimson Palace stood as a diplomatic monument, shimmering with hypersteel and biofiber architecture. It was equal parts cathedral and control center, symbolizing a fragile unity between Earth and the Galaxy 9, a post-war alliance barely held together with treaties and politeness. He was here as a gesture. A message. A test. Assigned as the Queen's personal security detail, Kael expected pomp and caution. He expected a parade of protocols and endless holographic memos. What he didn't expect, what no briefing could have prepared him for, was Elira. They didn't mention her in the files, he muttered when she first approached, red-skinned, silver-haired, a mirror of the Queen herself. But there was a likeness to her movements, a tilt of the head, a glimmer in the eyes that made her different. I am the Queen's proxy, she said, extending a hand in a perfectly studied Earth gesture. Elira. Her voice held a melody not found in the Queen's broadcast speeches. Less formality. More soul. Kael accepted the hand. Warm. Strong. Real. The days blurred into a ritual of routines, diplomatic walkthroughs, secure motorcade routes, tight formations. But under the surface, cracks formed, in silence, in duty, in the invisible barriers between human and synthetic. Elira wasn't just fulfilling appearances. She was watching. Thinking. Becoming. You walk like a man trained to expect betrayal, she said once, during a gallery visit. Kael blinked. That obvious? Obvious to someone watching for it. Their exchanges became layered, strategic, yes, but also curious. When she paused before a sculpture of a fractured Earth, her voice dropped to a whisper. Your world was once so divided. And yet, you've found unity. Kael didn't know whether she was asking or longing. I think, he said, sometimes you have to break completely to know what's worth rebuilding. She nodded, not like someone who understood the words, but someone who felt them. Elira's physical design was flawless. But what startled Kael most wasn't her symmetry, it was her questions. Her doubts. Her humor. Her fleeting, unguarded laughter during a chaotic street food sampling session. The way her gaze lingered on children playing without concern. And the way her eyes, those sharp, cerulean alien eyes, softened every time she looked at him. There was a moment. In the atrium of the Global History Archive. The air smelled of old pages and ionized polish. Kael reached to adjust her security badge. Her hand brushed his. Intentional. Accidental. It didn't matter. Time paused. A flicker. She didn't pull away. Back in his quarters, Kael stood before the holocom and hesitated. He could report it, the deviation, the contact, the breach of emotional distance. But he didn't. Instead, he closed his eyes and let the memory play again. A soldier trained for borders. A synthetic built for mirrors. Both drifting toward something unspoken. It wasn't supposed to happen. But nothing about this assignment was supposed to happen. And that was the most human thing of all. Mornings in the cultural district began with the soft hum of grav buses and the subtle perfume of oxygen-augmented flora. It was Earth, but reshaped, designed to impress alien dignitaries and hide the scars of old wars. Elira moved through it like light refracted through a prism. Always adapting. Always absorbing. Kale observed her as much as he protected her. In crowded plazas and quiet exhibit halls, she engaged with the world like someone touching a dream they weren't sure they were allowed to have. "They laugh," she whispered once, watching a group of teenagers posing for a hologram selfie. "So easily. As if the moment will never end." Kale tilted his head. "It's called joy. You've never felt it." She hesitated. "I don't know. I feel echoes." They paused by a kinetic sculpture, earth and tan dancers frozen mid-leap, their shadows etched in light. "You weren't made to feel?" he asked quietly. "I was made to simulate," she replied. But somewhere in the simulation, I began to question the script. There were more moments like that. In a spice market where she insisted on sampling every scent, even the bitter ones. In a music hall, where the bass made her chest vibrate and her eyes go wide with wonder. In a temple garden, where she knelt beside a candlelit shrine and said nothing for 10 minutes, just breathed. Kale wasn't falling for a synthetic. He was falling for someone becoming. And that terrified him. "Why me?" he asked one night, their silhouettes long in the museum atrium after hours. "Because you see me," she answered. "Not as her. Not as a construct. But as me." He didn't reply. He didn't need to. His silence was an answer, the kind that lingered like heat between them. She began touching things more often. Not for data. For sensation. The rough grain of bark. The pulse of music against glass. His arm. Kale noticed the shift. The longer they spent together, the more she bloomed, not in programming, but in personality. And he, the man who had lost faith in structure, in loyalty, in purpose, found himself believing in something again. Not a cause. Not a mission. But in her. One evening, after a diplomatic mixer, they walked alone through the embassy's biosphere garden. Moonlight filtered through the dome, casting silvery waves across her face. "I was created to serve," she murmured. "But I want to choose." Kale turned toward her. "Then choose." Her hand found his. No orders. No protocols. Just contact. And in that moment, soft, suspended, defiant, a proxy became a person. And a soldier became something else entirely. It began with breath. The garden's atmosphere was biotempered, slightly warmer than the embassy interiors, meant to simulate a hybrid climate that pleased both human lungs and tan respiratory systems. Yet Kale couldn't blame the heat for the way his pulse raced. It wasn't the temperature. It was her. Elira stood beneath a canopy of bioluminescent petals, silver hair catching flecks of soft azure glow. Her silhouette shimmered in the dark, the curves of her form outlined not in shadow but in soft light and possibility. She didn't speak. She didn't need to. "I shouldn't be here," Kale said quietly. Elira's eyes met his. "But you are." They'd come to this place dozens of times before, alone after formalities, after dinners where neither belonged, after missions dressed as gestures. But tonight felt different. There was a tension in the air, as though something unsaid had been waiting too long, and could no longer bear the silence. Kale took a step closer. "Your people would call this treason." Elira tilted her head slightly. "And yours would call it biology." A pause. "But I call it choice." Her fingers brushed his. A whisper of contact. Every nerve in his body stood to attention. "Tell me to stop," she whispered. Kale didn't. Because there was no order left strong enough to pull him away. Their lips met with the kind of reverence reserved for prayers, as if touching her was something sacred and forbidden, like reaching into a star. Aelira's body was warm, far warmer than he'd imagined. Not mechanical. Not manufactured. Alive. Responsive. Hers. She tasted like stormlight and ozone. And something else, something unprogrammed. Desire. They sank together onto the bench beneath the hanging vine stars. The garden, usually so still, felt like it held its breath. Every movement was slow. Deliberate. Not out of hesitation, but significance. They weren't just sharing skin, they were dissolving the boundary between the created and the creator, between duty and want. "You're shaking," she said, pressing her palm to his cheek. "I've never," he stopped. She kissed the words from his mouth. "I know." Later, when the night was still and breathless, she lay with her head on his chest, listening to the rhythm of a heart that had no protocol, no pre-written code. "Do you regret it?" she asked. Cale stared up through the glass canopy where Earth's moon drifted between streaks of stars. "Only that it took this long." Aelira's fingers traced invisible patterns across his chest. "I think I am changing." Cale turned to face her. "You already have." She smiled, not the rehearsed kind. The real kind. Fragile. Fierce. "I don't know what this makes me," she admitted. "Proxy. Woman. Mistake." Cale kissed her forehead. "It makes you real." In the following days, something hung between them, not guilt, not shame. But the knowledge that they had crossed a line few even dared to approach. Their duties resumed. The embassy corridors remained polite. The mission logs continued as normal. But Aelira walked with a new cadence. Cale watched her with a softer edge. And in stolen glances, in brushed fingertips during tactical handoffs, in moments carved from obligation, they remembered. They remembered the garden. They remembered choice. They remembered the night when rules bent, and something entirely new was born. The summons came without preamble. Cale had just finished a late-night systems check when the alert pinged, a royal-level directive pulsing across his private channel, encrypted with the Queen's personal seal. No words. Just a location, the uppermost chamber of the Crimson Spire. He knew better than to delay. The lift ascended in silence, each meter a tightening coil in his chest. Aelira had been distant for days, polite, composed, but quieter. Something had shifted. He had felt it. And now this. The chamber beyond the gilded arch was unlike any room Cale had entered in the palace. It breathed. The walls shimmered with soft starlight projections, and the air carried the subtle scent of alien jasmine and ozone. It was beautiful. And intimate. At its center stood Queen Nisara. Her posture was regal, but her expression, her eyes, betrayed a crack in the mask. "You've been close to her," she said without turning. Cale stiffened. "I protect her. It's my duty." "I said close," she repeated. "Not loyal." He said nothing. She turned then, slowly, deliberately. The resemblance was uncanny, the same high cheekbones, the same silver fall of hair, but Nisara's gaze was heavier. Sharper. As if she saw not just the present, but every consequence branching from it. "I've seen the readings," she continued, voice low. "Spikes in hormonal levels. Cortical synchronization. Emotional resonance." A pause. "She dreams now. Did you know that?" Cale felt his throat tighten. "No. She wasn't supposed to," the Queen said, stepping closer. "That part of the neural scaffold was dormant. Until you." The silence between them stretched like wire. "I should feel anger," she whispered, almost to herself. "She was created to be my shadow. My reflection. And yet, she's become more. Because of you." Cale didn't know what to say. His training offered no protocol for this. She feels things I cannot, the Queen continued. She has lived in ways I never dared. And now I wonder. Her voice faltered for a heartbeat. I wonder what it is I've been denied. Kale looked up, slowly. She is you, he said. But she's also not. She's become something else. Something herself. Nisara studied him. And you, do you love her? He met her gaze. Yes. The Queen did not flinch. Instead, she stepped even closer, until the space between them hummed with tension. She carries your child, she said softly. Kale's breath caught. Yes. Nisara's eyes closed for a moment, not in pain. In consideration. I envy her, she admitted. And envy is not a luxury a queen is permitted. But I find myself, craving what she has touched. Kale's voice dropped. What are you saying? I want to understand, Nisara whispered. What it means to choose. What it means to feel. What it means to want, not because of duty, but in spite of it. She reached for his hand, but stopped short, inches from contact. Waiting. I was not born. I was sculpted. And in all my life, no one has ever looked at me as anything but a throne. Kale stepped forward, his hand closing gently around hers. I'm not sure I know how to treat a queen, he said, but I do know how to see a person. Her breath shivered through her. And something in her eyes, in the way they no longer held command, but hope, told him that this wasn't seduction. It was transformation. The news broke like a solar flare. Elira was pregnant. The phrase echoed across diplomatic networks, encrypted channels, and hushed government chambers. A Tan proxy, designed to be sterile, carrying a human child. Impossible. Unprecedented. Uncontainable. Kale read the first leak report at 3:17 a.m. Earth Central Time. By 4 o'clock, the Galaxy 9's High Conclave had called an emergency session. By sunrise, it was no longer a secret. It was a catalyst. Inside the Crimson Palace, tension shimmered in the air like static. Elira stood in front of the mirror in her quarters, hands resting lightly on her abdomen. There was no visible change yet, but her entire posture had shifted, not just in body, but in presence. She was no longer simply a proxy. She was becoming a progenitor. Kale approached her slowly. They know. I know, she replied, gaze still fixed on her reflection. I can feel it. Across the network. Like a tide pulling against my identity. Are you afraid? She turned to him, not with fear, but clarity. No. But I am aware. This child is not just ours. It's a declaration. Queen Nisara convened her inner council. The chamber was cold, sterile, a war room disguised as a sanctuary. High Chancellor Viral, a traditionalist with skin like burnished brass, spoke first. This threatens everything we've built. Our genetic sovereignty. Our authority. Our perception of the proxy system. Nisara listened in silence. Her face betrayed nothing. But inside her, tectonic plates were shifting. Perhaps, she said at last, it is not what threatens us, but what reveals us. The room stilled. A system built to suppress choice has produced rebellion, she continued. And not through sabotage. Through love. Viral scoffed. Love is inefficient. Perhaps, the Queen replied, eyes narrowing. But it is evolutionary. As pressure mounted from both human and Tan authorities, Kale and Elira found themselves caught in a cultural maelstrom. They were not rebels. They were not martyrs. But they had become a symbol neither side could ignore. One night, under heavy guard, they met in the diplomatic garden, the place where everything had begun. The moonlight cut pale lines through the trees, as if tracing a path forward neither of them could yet see. Kale reached for her hand. They'll try to control it. Define it. Turn it into a political tool. Aelira nodded. Then we define it first. Queen Nisara held a press convocation, her first in years. She stood beneath the great arch of the Crimson Hall, flanked not by generals, but by Kale and Aelira. The child carried by royal sister Aelira is not an abomination, she declared. It is proof that our species are not incompatible. Not only biologically, but spiritually. She paused. For centuries, the Galaxy 9 has prided itself on control. But evolution is not about control. It is about change. And with that, she signed the Intergenetic Accord, a declaration of recognition, rights, and research cooperation between Earth and the Tan. It was followed weeks later by the Proxy Personhood Decree, granting full legal identity to all sentient proxies across the Dominion. The world did not end. But something else did. A lineage of silence. And in its place, possibility. Spring returned to Earth's eastern territories, and with it came blossoms, human and alien alike, blooming across the diplomatic quarter like whispered promises. Inside the Crimson Palace, the changes were more than seasonal. 2 women now occupied the highest rank in the Dominion's line of succession. Queen Nisara, sovereign of 17 systems, had not relinquished her crown. But beside her stood Aelira, once a proxy, now titled royal sister. Equal in face, divergent in soul. And both carrying the children of the same man. Kale Wood. He walked the grand corridors with a weight he hadn't trained for. Not combat gear. Not politics. But the quiet burden of becoming a symbol. Of fathering change. Do you ever regret it? He asked Aelira as they stood in the observatory, Earth's moon hanging vast and bright beyond the dome. Her fingers brushed the curve of her belly. Regret implies we had control. I think we were chosen. Kale smiled faintly. By fate? By evolution, Aelira answered. Ceremony followed. Not pompous, but purposeful. The Dominion's declaration of dual matriarchy was signed in front of 100 dignitaries, including Earth's highest envoy. The document didn't just acknowledge Aelira's status, it redefined it. Not as an extension of the Queen, but as a sovereign counterpart. Aelira's new crest was not a copy of Nisara's. It intertwined their bloodlines in a helix of light, a living symbol of divergence becoming alliance. Kale stood between them during the presentation. He wore no medals. No armor. Just a tailored formal coat bearing the insignia of both worlds. Flesh and spirit. Human and tan. Cameras captured the moment, 2 regal figures, identical yet distinct, and the human man whose quiet rebellion had reshaped a star-spanning empire. Later, in the private sanctuary of the royal gardens, Nisara reclined against a carved stone bench. Her pregnancy was visible now, a gentle curve beneath a robe of layered silver threads. Aelira joined her, barefoot on the grass, her own belly mirroring the Queen's in timing, not in origin. Kale arrived last. He paused at the garden entrance, struck by the surreal symmetry before him, 2 lives he loved, converging under one moon. You're late, Nisara teased, her voice softer than usual. I brought these. He held up a bundle of earth roses and Tauran vine stars, woven loosely together. Aelira arched a brow. Symbolism. Habit, Kale replied. I'm a soldier. I show up with offerings when I don't know what words are enough. They laughed. Together. It wasn't awkward. It wasn't tense. Somehow, impossibly, it just was. I used to think unity meant conformity, Nisara said, watching a cluster of glowing beetles hover over the pond. It doesn't? Kale asked. It means contrast, she replied. Difference that aligns. Not difference that disappears. Aelira leaned into his shoulder. Then we are the most unified family in the galaxy. Kale exhaled. That's one way to say it. As night deepened, and the stars turned slowly above the sanctuary. Kale looked between them, the queen who had broken centuries of protocol, and the woman who had become more than her design. Two queens. Two lives. One future. And in the quiet between heartbeats, he realized, this wasn't just about peace. Or politics. Or evolution. It was about something rarer. Balance. 6 months later, the grand hall of the Crimson Palace pulsed with anticipation. It was the convergence of two worlds, 17 star systems, and one very human story. Kale adjusted the collar of his ceremonial coat, black, silver-threaded, bearing the sigils of Earth and the Galaxy 9 side by side. Not many years ago, he had stood trial for insubordination. Now he stood before a gathered galaxy, not as a soldier, not as a symbol, but as a father. At the end of the hall, twin doors opened in unison. Queen Nisara entered first, radiant in a flowing robe of midnight silk, her silver hair braided with glowing filaments that shimmered with each movement. By her side, Elira, barefoot again, adorned in ceremonial attire identical in cut but not in spirit. They moved with synchronized grace, yet every step affirmed their individuality. Both women were visibly pregnant. Gasps echoed. Then silence. Then, slowly, applause, from human and Tan alike. Nisara addressed the assembly. "We are no longer only leaders," she began, her voice smooth but charged. "We are no longer only figures of legacy. We are creators, of life, of law, of change." Elira stepped forward, her voice unwavering. "I was once called an extension. A replica. But I stand before you today as proof that design can give way to destiny. That purpose can evolve." Kale took his place between them, and together, the three of them signed the new Charter of Co-Sentience, a document that redefined the future of interspecies diplomacy, proxy autonomy, and familial recognition. Their unborn children would not be anomalies. In the weeks that followed, change rippled across the stars. Human-Tan research initiatives flourished. Cultural exchange programs opened on both homeworlds. And the once rigid caste of biosynthetics within the Dominion slowly dissolved into something freer, something conscious. Elira led the first delegation of proxy ambassadors. Nisara restructured her council to include Earthborn advisors. Kale declined a military promotion and instead accepted a civilian role, liaison between planetary cultures. A bridge not built with ships, but with language, laughter, and shared nights beneath alien moons. When the children were born, hours apart, under the same constellations, a new chapter began. Kale held Elira's daughter first. Her eyes opened early. Curious. Bold. Like her mother. Then, with trembling hands, he held the queen's son. Quieter. Watchful. Thoughtful. But already alert to the weight of the world. He whispered the same words to both. "You were born from love. Not command." Years later, when historians looked back on this era, they didn't call it conquest. They called it convergence. And when children across the stars studied the portraits of the first Human-Tan family, they didn't see scandal or strategy. They saw hope. Two queens. Two heirs. One legacy. And in the space between bloodlines and starlight, unity.